Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Neufeld. Today, I am very excited to be joined by Aaron Hector. Aaron is a financial planner and private wealth advisor with CWB Wealth in Calgary. And Aaron is an absolute expert in the details of the First Home Savings Account. This is a new plan that's going to be available to us very soon. And this episode, we cover off a lot of the high-level features and some of the very nitty-gritty details of how we can best use this new plan to our advantage. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Aaron Hector on the First Home Savings Account. Okay, well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Evan. My pleasure.
Okay, so today we are talking about yet another acronym in our business, the FHSA. Am I getting that right? First Home Savings Account. And
that's right.
So Aaron is joining me from Calgary today, and he has taken it upon himself to be an expert in the First Home Savings Account. I first came across your writing, I think it was on Twitter, actually. Are you elsewhere? Are you posting on LinkedIn or anything like that?
I do a bit of posting on both, but I'm more active on Twitter than I am on LinkedIn, just because the more conversational style of it.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of intricacies with a new plan type like this. And when I started seeing some of your tweets, I'm like, my goodness, I got to get this guy in the podcast because he knows what's going on with the First Home Savings Account. So maybe I'll just let you give me a bit of an intro, or give our listeners a bit of an intro. What is the First Home Savings Account?
Sure. So this is a new account that, as of the date of recording here, kind of in the end of March, we don't have access to it quite yet, but it's coming really soon. It's an account that's designed to help first-time home buyers get into home ownership with a little bit of help from the government. One pretty easy way to look at it is that it combines the more favorable characteristics of both an R.R.S.P. with a tax-free savings account. And so with, just as a backup to that comment, with R.R.S.Ps, when you make a contribution, that contribution gives you a tax deduction, which lowers your income that's subject to the tax calculation. And as a result, most people would end up with a refund on their tax return. So contributions into this FHSA account work the same way, where you get this front-end tax deduction. And then that's kind of the end of the similarities with an RRSP, because then, of course, with an RRSP, your account balance grows, tax deferred. But ultimately, when you pull the money out, the opposite happens on your tax return, where now that withdrawal adds to your income and results in extra tax in the future. So with this account, you get that tax deduction, but then the account grows and grows and grows with your investment returns. And then when time comes to withdraw the money, it comes out 100% tax-free. So very similar to a tax-free savings account in that there's no annual taxation. The money can come out without being subject to tax, so long as it's in conjunction with the purchase of your first home. So it's a pretty slick account. The legislation becomes effective on April 1st of this year. Doesn't necessarily mean that the place where you do your investing is going to have it ready to go on April 1st. There's lots of stuff that goes on in the background with financial institutions being approved by CRA. And so it's going to be kind of case by case, but the earliest you could ever possibly see it is April 1st of 2023. I think it's going to be more commonly available this summer into the fall even, but it'll be kind of case by case. Some will be earlier, some will be longer. Some financial institutions have a wait list for it. So basically you put your name on a list and they'll notify you when it's ready. So that's been happening now for a month or so. So, the kind of the writing's on the wall there, so that I think the tempering some expectations so that people understand that you might not be able to get access to it immediately.
Right. And for all of you listening, it's worth noting that while Aaron is an expert on the details here, he does not represent the government or CRA on any of the details here by any means. And so we're just trying to provide as much info as we can in advance of these things becoming available. Okay, so let's go back to kind of the mechanics of how these things work a little bit. So talking about an RSP and how those kind of work, my challenge with RSPs has always been the fact that it requires a little bit of future prediction to kind of figure out how beneficial an RSP is going to be, meaning if you contribute in a high rate and you withdraw in a low rate, fantastic. That's kind of like your tax arbitrage there a little bit. But here, doesn't really matter what rate you're in necessarily, because you're always withdrawing at a zero rate, right? So there's always going to be a net benefit based on whatever your marginal tax rate is at the time. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, 100% fair. Assuming, of course, that you do ultimately buy a home, right? Because if you don't, then it reverts back to the your typical RSP methodology on the way out as well. I didn't touch on that earlier, but it only works as it should if you follow through with your goal of a home purchase. But you're absolutely right. You do get a tax deduction on the way in, and it ultimately comes out tax-free, assuming, the home purchase tees up. And the other thing that is really kind of neat with this is that they don't force you to claim the tax deduction in the year you made your contribution. So if you're in a low income year, or you're just out of university, or you're just kind of getting your legs started in your career and you expect to be making more money in the upcoming years, you can save the tax deduction for a year or two down the or there's no timeline on when you would ultimately need to bring the tax deduction into play. So you can be a little strategic on the front end as well to try and maximize that return for you.
Very interesting. And even though it acts like an RSP on the way in, it has nothing to do with your RSP contribution room, does it?
No, you don't need RSP contribution room to use your first home saving account.
Yeah, so don't get it confused, listener, with with an RSP. It's just some of the mechanics end up being kind of the same. So okay, so the name is First Home Savings Account. So maybe can you give me some clarification on who can even open one of these things?
Sure. So you need to be a Canadian resident. So resident is different than citizen, first of all. Residency is where do you live? So you need to be living in Canada. You need to be at least age 18, and you can't be older than 71. So the range there is 18 to 71. And you need to be considered a first-time home buyer. And the definition on that is not, you would think it means you could never have owned a home before. It doesn't actually mean that. It just means you can't have owned a home in this year or any of the last 4 years. And it's actually even a little bit more specific than that, because I've had this question posed to me. Well, what if I don't own a home, but I live with my spouse or my common law partner and they have a home that's in their name? Well, you get captured under your spouse's ownership in that situation. So if you're currently living, or if you in the last 4 years have lived in a home owned by a spouse or common law partner, then you don't qualify either. So that's just kind of, it's a nuance. I don't think that's going to come up all that frequently, but that's just the way it's been set up. Okay. So just as another example on that, if you owned a home that you lived in 7 years ago and you sold it 7 years ago, and you haven't lived in a home that you or your partner have owned since then, you still qualify for this because the 4-year timeline has elapsed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know of someone that I'm thinking of right now where he owned a place and then sold it to go to school somewhere else, and has since become fond of renting in the meantime. Yeah. And so the years have passed, and this could be a good option if he does end up deciding to purchase again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's who can open one. What about the withdrawal rules? So it's buying a house, but it's got to be a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, of course. There's always little wrinkles. So first of all, if you need your money, you can get access to it even without buying a house. So if you put money into it with the goal of having a home, and life just doesn't play out the way that you had anticipated, and you need to take some money out of this account, you can. However, it's going to come out and be taxable. So every dollar that you withdraw is going to be, a taxable withdrawal, just, taxed the same way as another dollar of employment income. But hopefully your plans and your goals go according to plan. and you're eligible to make what's called a qualifying withdrawal. And those are the ones that this account is really designed for, to make it work properly with a tax-free withdrawal. So really, the situation there would be, you have an agreement to buy a home, and then you file a form with your financial institution where you kind of would describe the details around that home purchase. And then they would allow you to make a withdrawal tax-free. And kind of one thing to be careful of there is there's some time elements to be mindful of. So you can't request a withdrawal more than 30 days after you've closed on the house. So there has to be some forward thinking here. It can't be, oh, we bought our house and, oh, geez, I forgot I had this savings account, and you're thinking about this 6 months later. You would have been longer than 30 days after the closing date, and now you're no longer eligible to have a qualifying withdrawal. So there's a couple timelines you just have to be careful of. I think that some people will get tripped up on this because you've got so much going on when you're making your home purchase, movers, possession dates, getting things rekeyed. There's all these things you need to do. And if you don't think to make that withdrawal out of your account on time, you're kind of going to be quite negatively impacted by that. So it's just an important thing to be mindful of. The rule on that, it is the same timeline, the 30-day thing, as what's currently in place with the home buyer plan as well. And I know we'll probably talk a little bit more about the home buyers plan later on in the call today, but it's just something to be considered. Yeah.
Okay, now there's something to do with October. I remember going through the rules here. What's going on with that deadline of October 1st?
So I talked about the 30 days after you've closed. Well, the October is, on the before the closing date. You need to, if you're filling in the form, you need to close on your home by at least October of the following. So they give you a long lead up time, surprisingly long lead up time, actually. So you fill out the form, you do your withdrawal, and as long as you close before October of the next year, you're good.
Interesting. Okay. So theoretically, you can make a withdrawal in January and you close on it the following October. It's like 22 months.
Yeah. It makes you kind of shake your head, but that's the way it's been set up.
Maybe that's set up for...
No, I think they maybe do it such a long because this also qualifies for if you're constructing a home.
Right.
And we all know how long that can take too.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Yeah. If you live in a part of the country that still has room to build houses like Calgary or Saskatoon, like we are, that might be...
just keep expanding outward.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. We got to keep that horizon in play here at all times. Nice. Before we get too far, I don't think we've talked about contribution amounts. Like how much can you actually put in these things? I know TFSAs obviously have, that limit has changed. And then with RSPs, it's based on your income. So how does it work with a FHSA?
Yeah. So you have $40,000 of lifetime contribution room. However, you can't put $40,000 in a single year. You have to put it in to the maximum of $8,000 per year. So it's going to take you 5 years to get it fully topped up. So if you start one in 2023, you're going to be up to 2028 until you have the $40,000 totally in. However, if let's say you open an account in 2023, but you only put in $4,000 this year, well, next year they'll let you get caught back up on that. So next year you could put in the $8,000 for next year plus the additional $4,000 from this year, for a total of 12 next year. But that carry forward of prior year contributions is capped to a maximum of $8,000. So if you go 3 years without making a contribution, you can still only put in 8 for the current year and 8 for the total of those prior 3 years. It doesn't stack 1 year on top of the other on top of the other. You're kind of capped at, I guess you could look at it this way, 16,000 in a single year is the most you could ever put in 1 year because the $8,000 of max catch-up room. So there's some restrictions on that. A planning point, I would say, to people who have home ownership as a goal, but maybe they don't have $8,000 to put in, or maybe they're expecting to get a large bonus next year. Like say the annual bonus time is February or March of any given year. Well, you still probably want to establish your account this year so that going into next year, when you get that bonus, you can put in the 16,000. Because if you, the carry forward room of unused contributions will not accrue if you don't have an account actually opened. So that's kind of I have it in my head that anyone that thinks they're going to be buying a home in the near term should open an account, even if you don't have money to put into it.
Gotcha. So it's not based on your initial contribution. So you don't need to put in $100 just to validate the opening or anything like that. It's just to fill out your paperwork, sign it, and get it open.
Yeah. And this is especially true just because of the nature of getting that tax deduction is so important. Like, you don't want to miss out on a tax deduction. And because of the timelines with this account, so maybe I'll back up a little bit. With the home, and this maybe is more around the withdrawal side of things, but with the home buyers plan, which has been available for years and years and years, the rule with that was that to be eligible to make a withdrawal out of that plan, you need to have put money into your R.S.P. 89 days before your withdrawal with the home buyers plan. With the FHSA account, there is no holding time period requirements. So you could, in theory, make your contribution one day and withdraw it the next day, and you could still get your tax deduction. So the reason I'm bringing this up now is because we're talking about opening up an account to establish this carry forward room. Because if you get out into a year and all of a sudden there's a home that you want to buy, you could very quickly even go out, get a line of credit or a loan from the bank for $16,000, draw on your line of credit to put it into your first home account, and then withdraw it right away and pay your line of credit off to get a tax deduction for $16,000 without, and maybe you only have a couple days of interest. Like, the opportunities for planning around this are quite phenomenal, actually. But to max out even that, you need to have the ability to put in $16,000. Otherwise, you're restricted to only $8,000. So for anyone who thinks you're, even if you're just loosely looking on, the real estate listings in your neighborhood, you should have one of these accounts so that if that magic house, the unicorn, pops up and you got to act quickly, you can still take advantage of this as best you can.
Very interesting. Okay, there's 101 questions here, so I'll try to remember all my questions as I go. But my wheels were turning as you were talking there. That's really interesting. Okay, one thing to keep in mind that maybe you can clarify for me here: the tax deduction is not some sort of instant bonus that you'll receive from the government that'll be deposited into your account or anything like that, right? So when you make your contribution, you still have to wait till the next year to file your taxes, and then you'll get that refund based on your marginal tax rate in that year.
That's correct. It's a delayed gratification,
right?
And that gratification comes when you file your next tax return.
Right. And maybe if you had enough money on hand anyways to buy your house, maybe that's, say, your furniture fund, or finish off the basement, or do the landscaping the next summer or something like that.
100%. That's right.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Okay.
One other clarification on the contribution side is we're talking about January to December with this account. It's different than with RRSPs. You're kind of looking at March 1st to March 1st every year. You have this first 60 days of the next year that you can then take the January, February contributions and put it against the prior year tax return. With your first home savings account, there's no first 60 days of the next year. It is January 1st to December 31st.
In some ways, it keeps things simple that way, right?
I agree.
Yeah, for sure.
It's one of those things, I think there's so many comparables to RRSPs that people can get tripped up over these kind of subtle differences between the two.
Yeah, but some of the things that you were talking about there with the catch-up room and the lifetime maximum and things like that, that sounds a little bit like an RESP almost, right? Some of the structures were almost borrowed. Were you tweeting about that the other day, or did I see that from somebody else?
Yeah, I was. So I put it in one of the things that I've written about this account. I put a chart together comparing the FHSA to the TFSA and the RRSP, but I threw in the RESP, the education account, for good measure, because I think this takes different things from the education plan as well. The fact that you have a lifetime contribution room, the fact that you're restricted on annual contribution limits. So with the RESP, you only get the government grant on $2,500 a year, even though the lifetime contribution limit is $50K. So the ability to catch up on contributions that you didn't make in prior year, it's limited to the 1 year of catch up as well. $8,000 for the TFSA, $2,500 for the RESP. And then finally, it's so simple, but you need to have a life event to make it work. So with the RESP, you can save, but if you don't have a child that pursues further education after grade 12, it kind of falls apart a little bit, where it doesn't work as designed. Same thing here with the FHSA. The tax characteristics fall apart, so it's not as good of a deal if you don't buy a house. So I think, sure, the headlines are all about how this account is a hybrid of TFSA and RRSP, but honestly, it's a hybrid of those three accounts in total. So I haven't heard anyone else really talking about that. And I'm like, hey, don't forget.
Don't forget, it's way more complicated than that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So if the idea is that you want to get one open as soon as possible, if you're not currently a homeowner, if it's a goal for you at all, get it open. How long can you keep one open? Like you mentioned, you can open it between 18 and not older than 71.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's a huge range in there. I assume you can't keep one open from 18 to 71.
No, you're restricted to a 15-year hold in total. So,
and is that from initial account opening or initial contribution?
From initial account opening.
Okay.
And it's from the moment you start, or from when you open your first FHSA. Because just like a tax-free savings account, you could have one at one bank, another at another bank. You could have 3 or 4, however many you want, as long as you stay within the contribution limits in aggregate. So this works the same, but if you open up your first FHSA at bank number 1, and then 5 years later, you open up the second at another bank, that second account really only has 10 years, right? It gets tracked back to the first opening.
Gotcha. Okay. Good stuff there. Okay. So you're describing the average person's convoluted financial life. You could have multiple here and there and everywhere. Lots of people have an RSP already. No one has an FHSA yet, but because people might possibly have RSP money already, we talked about the home buyers plan a little bit. Can it be combined? Like, can you kind of pool your resources in this way so that you can still access your RSPs?
Yes. So this is interesting, and there's a lot of misinformation about this because the details with the FHSA account have been slowly rolled out in different, announcements over, really, it's been a couple of years now since they first mentioned or hinted at the possibility of this. And so quite a few times over the last couple of years, they've said that you will not, be able to use both the first home savings account and the RRSP featured home buyers plan on the same house purchase. But when the final legislation was actually drawn up, they scrapped that one or the other rule with this. So now you can actually use both your RRSP savings via the home buyers plan withdrawal. And in addition to that, on the same purchase, your first home savings account, which is a pretty sweet deal. So with your home buyers plan, you can take up to $35,000 out of your RRSP. And it's not taxable like RRSP withdrawals normally is, but then you do have a repayment obligation. So you have to put, over the next 15 years, you have to put 1/15 of that withdrawal back into your RRSP. And if you don't, then that 1/15 would be brought into your income in that year. So with the FHSA, it's kind of nice because it comes out tax-free and there's no requirement to pay it back. There's no ability to pay it back, but you can stack these one on top of the other. So if you over 5 years put in $40,000 into your FHSA, you can take that amount out And in addition to that, you can take 35K out of your RRSP through the home buyers plan. And as a couple, you can multiply all of that by 2. So you're talking about up to $150,000 if you have the ability as a couple to get this much saved over, a 5-year period, which is pretty powerful.
Interesting.
And it could even be more than that, because whatever your FHSA account grows to comes out tax-free. So it's not just the 40,000 that you can put into it. It's what are the investment return possibilities on that too.
Right. Okay. Thinking on my feet here, I haven't decided if this is a stupid question yet or not, so feel free to call me out on that. But
let's ask it.
Okay. Is it possible to transfer money from an RSP into the FHSA? Because I like the idea of tax-free growth and tax-free withdrawals. Theoretically, I don't like the idea of repayment. Like the mechanism of the FHSA is way better, I think. Even though dollar amounts are different and the mechanisms are different, it's a bit of an apples to oranges. But if you had RSP money only say enough to make the contributions to the FHSA, can you transfer it in there?
Yes, you can. So you can transfer either direction, actually. So you can go, so let's say, first of all, if you have existing savings in an RRSP and you would rather use the first home savings account withdrawal platform as opposed to your home buyers plan, because primarily probably you don't want to have to repay the money. That'd probably be the main reason. You can direct, again, up to $8,000 per year from your RRSP into your first home savings account. And then when you go to buy your house, you make a withdrawal from your first home savings account and the money comes out tax-free. In doing that, you don't get more RRSP contribution room. So you kind of forever burn that room. You also just want to make sure that long-term, it's really what you want too, because some people really like the home buyers plan because you're allowed to repatriate money back into that account. Because, if you look at it, if you're early in your life, you might be feeling cash flow crunch because you're not making as much in your career. But if you're on the trajectory where you think things are going to get easier for you in the future, it might be nice to be able to funnel that back into your RSP, because tax deferred compounding, like it honestly makes a difference over time. So some people want to have more money in their RSPs. So you just have to be kind of mindful of that. You don't get the RSP room back when you move it into your FHSA. Now, you can also go the other direction. So let's say you put money into your first home savings account, 15 years go by, the right home or the right situation never came up. Well, you're not forced into just withdrawing the money out of your FHSA and paying the tax on it at that time. You can transfer it from the FHSA into your RRSP, and that's not a taxable event. Now, eventually, way down the road in your retirement years, you will need to one day pay the tax on that money when it comes as a withdrawal from your RRSP, or eventually maybe even your RIF account when you get into your 70s, 80s. But you can push that tax down the road, which is kind of an important thing to consider. But the same thing occurs there, money going from FHSA to an RRSP, or you can even transfer it directly into a RIF from the FHSA account as well. If you have a RIF and you've opted to open that account younger than you need to, that's fine. But you don't all of a sudden get more FHSA contribution room either. So, yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, totally. So when transferring and under that circumstance, the cool thing that I've seen is that, you don't need the RSP room to transfer it in there. So it's compounding your RSP. Compounding is probably not the good word, but it's increasing your RSP contribution room.
Yeah, so that's where this account is pretty cool, because some people just don't have the desire to be a homeowner. They like renting. Maybe in the city that they live in, the financial metrics of home ownership don't make sense compared to renting, and they just don't want to be a home owner. But this account can still work for them, because ultimately you could think of it as a way for lifelong renters to have an additional $40,000 of RRSP room. So it has different use cases that are kind of outside the traditional box of what you might think for this account.
So we talked about combining with a spouse, things like that. So with an RSP, your income is yours, and we don't have, in your earning years anyways, we don't have income splitting between spouses, but you can do spousal RSPs to kind of rejig things for the future. Mm-hmm. So in terms of contributing for a spouse, how does that work? So say my spouse doesn't work and I'm the sole breadwinner, but we can theoretically both have one. Mm-hmm. I guess if she has money in hers, the tax deduction on zero income, it doesn't really mean a whole lot anyways. But anyways, maybe walk me through how it works with contributing to a spouse's plan.
So I can't directly transfer money from my bank account into my wife's first home savings account.
Okay.
That's a no-no. The way that this has been set up is that the only person who can make a contribution into their account is the account holder themselves. However, I can gift money to my spouse, and she can take that money and put it into her FHSA, and that's totally fine. There's no attribution that would come back to me as the original source of that money, which is a little different than the way that tax attribution works for a lot of different accounts. And talk about the simplest workaround ever. Sure, I can't top up your FHSA for you, but I'll just give you the money and you do it like that. So it's kind of semantics almost, but that gifting arrangement is totally A-okay.
Which is kind of like TFSAs too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Now, there's some kind of longer term income splitting things you can consider here, which may be a little outside the scope of this conversation, but I'll say it anyways.
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it. I'll keep it for myself at the very least. Yeah.
So let's look at, that scenario where you have a high income earner and a low income earner. Well, if I put money into an FHSA, and let's say that I'm in 65 years, between 65 and 71, let's just say. I put money into my FHSA. I then could transfer that into a RIF and then make a withdrawal. And what happens with RIF withdrawals when you're at least 65 is you can split half of that with your spouse. So it's a small income splitting opportunity to kind of flow $8,000 a year for 5 years and split that money with a low income earner just via the way that the FHSA can kind of operate in combination with a sideways transfer into a RIF. So that's one thing.
Oh,
another
okay.
thing is if me as a high income earner.
Sorry, I was cutting you off, Aaron. So for the person that has downsized, like in their not so old years, but say they're, the kids are out of the house and they sell off the big house with the big yard and they move into a condo that they're renting now, 4 years later, they could do this in their 60s, theoretically, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. As long as at least, the current year or neither of the last 4 years before this year, you didn't own a home, you're now eligible. So this isn't only for quote unquote young people. This is for anyone up to age 71. And there's some interesting use cases for, early retirees or, leading into retirement, that age gap too, where this can provide some useful planning opportunities as well.
Very interesting. Sorry, I wasn't intentionally cutting you off entirely there, but you had another thought that I'm sure you've long forgotten now.
No, I got it. So the other thing is, as a high income earner, I can just gift, up to $40,000 over 5 years to my spouse. Then down the road, if together as a couple we don't buy a home and we opt to not transfer it into an RRSP and it just becomes taxable as a withdrawal, it's going to be taxable to her, not to me. So that's another way where there's a little bit of splitting of income from a high income spouse to a low income spouse that you can consider. And then my final point on the spousal considerations would be if you're wanting to take advantage of transferring money from an RRSP into the first home savings account, and the source RRSP is a spousal RRSP, you need to be careful about this because the 3-year rule applies. And so just so many of these things, you have to give a bit of background because you don't necessarily know if the people listening would understand what I'm talking about. So I'll backtrack us for a second here. When you fund a spousal RSP, there's this thing called the 3-year rule, which indicates that if in the next 3 years you make a withdrawal out of the spousal RSP, the contributor, who's not the account holder, would be taxed on the withdrawal. And so it's the current year plus the prior 2 calendar years is the rule here. So if you are utilizing a spousal RSP, you wouldn't be able to use that to FHSA if there have been contributions in the last 3 years because of this 3-year rule, and because of the rules that dictate that only the account holder's money can be used to fund the FHSA. So they've kind of put some restrictions on this. So it's just another one of those things to kind of watch out for, to be careful for.
Okay, this is good. Maybe let's deviate from some of the edge cases here on the fun stuff that's like, oh,
sorry, I can't help myself.
I can't either. This is really good. But one thing that people might be thinking about, say, if we've talked about the lifelong renter or the person that doesn't really have home ownership for themselves as a primary goal, they say like, okay, well, I've never owned a home, but what if I bought one to rent it out? Do I actually have to occupy this house myself to qualify, or how does that work?
Yeah, so if you're wanting to use the FHSA, it has to be for a home that you intend to live in. And you need to live in it, I think the rule is within a year of your withdrawal. You need to actually be residing in the house.
Gotcha. Duplex?
That's fine. Yeah. So there's lots of different. So
right, I'm thinking of like I live on the one side and I rent out the other side, but I'm buying the roof. Okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as you're living in it, and actually the ownership, I think it's as low as 10%, and you still qualify under this. So you can, as long as you're living in it and you have partial ownership of a place up to at least 10%, you're good to go for the criteria for this.
Gotcha. Okay, so as far as giving a really good overview, a few unique planning opportunities here, I think we covered off a lot of them, but some of my takeaways here so far is that if you don't have a home, like if you qualify to open one of these plans, do it. That's a big takeaway. And however you can get some money into it would maybe be another one. Do you have any unique planning opportunities for making contributions?
You hear about RSP loans. It's a pretty common thing in the industry, whether you like it or not. You've probably heard about it. I think the use case for a loan, if you don't have the money for an FHSA, considering how short-natured your holding requirement, like that's going to be a common thing, I think. It'll almost be hand in hand with a purchase. It's like, oh, you're buying a house. Do you have an FHSA? Why not? Like, just put some money in there for a short period of time, take it out, get your tax deduction. I think even, you're going to see lots of parents who are helping their kids out with homes. And I think that happens commonly for those who are fortunate enough to come from a family where the parents are willing to help. This is another account where parents could fund an account for children who maybe don't have the financial capability to do it themselves. But kind of tying on to that line of credit idea, even if the parents don't really have that flexibility within their long-term retirement plans to, just give money away like that to the next generation, as a short-term loan potential, the gift might not be, here's $8,000 or $16,000 of cash, take it. It might be income. I'm going to gift you a tax deduction. So here's $8,000 or 16, depending if you open the account a little earlier. Put it in your FHSA for a short period of time. When that money ultimately comes back, give it back to me. But then at least you have that tax deduction going forward. It's a way for parents to not really have a financial outlay, but still help their kids to kind of be set up in a more favorable financial situation. And it's kind of like almost loopholes, right? But there's no reason why these things wouldn't work for just normal families out there. And what else is there? Ideally, you just can figure out how to save the money yourself. If you have money in a TFSA, that's another great source of money to strip out of your tax-free savings account and put it into your FHSA. I think for anyone who is planning to buy a house where that's a goal, the FHSA is really, it's a better home for your savings in the short term than a TFSA, so long as you can manage unexpected expenses in the meantime. And I would kind of use the R.S.P transfer as more of a third or a fourth option. I would say free cash flow, build it into your budget. That's the best way. If you have a TFSA, use that. Maybe look at the line of credit even. And then if none of those work and you just are sour on the home buyer's plan, then that RRSP transfer may be the backup. So yeah, there's quite a few ways to think about funding it, but depending on everyone's individual circumstances, there's going to be a better alternative.
Right.
Or the right alternative.
Yeah. I'm thinking of like a cascading contribution. So say, because you can do the home buyer's plan in conjunction with it. So say you had $8,000 theoretically, let's see. I guess you can do one or the other. So you put your $8,000 into the FHSA, you get your deduction or your refund the following year, and you put that into your RSP or whatever. You could just use the same total outlay, but use your refund to go into the other to generate another refund that could go back into the other. You know what I mean? So it's kind of this cascading approach of maximizing the use of your tax refund with minimal cash up front.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. And even for younger families, the fact that these tax deductions are going to increase your Canada Child benefit as well. It cascades there too, right? So just the timing of when you might choose to claim your tax deduction on your contributions, both for RRSPs and for the FHSA. If you think you're going to be having a family and kids in the next year or two, that's just another good reason to defer the tax deduction until you have kids. If it's kind of on the planning horizon, or already in pregnancy, and you can see that the next year you're going to have a child or a second or a third child, every additional child you have, your effective tax rate is actually higher because of the way that the Canada Child benefit is calculated. It's based off of net income. So just the planning around this, it's pretty complex, but also it's very interesting to think about the different ways that you can use this to maximize, your financial situation.
Awesome. The Canada Child benefit, I feel like we got to have you on another episode here to get into the weeds on that one. Maybe there's not as much weeds to get into with the Canada Child.
There wouldn't be as much to talk about, but I'd be happy to come back and kick it around with you for sure. But the one other thing that I think is maybe important for people to consider that we haven't touched on yet is just on the estate planning side. So it's just so critically important. I have to bring it up. And this is the same thing if you're listening, you have RRSP accounts, TFSA accounts, any registered account. Make sure you know who you want to name as your beneficiary and actually name that person. Depending on the platform you're on, quite often it's easy to set up an account, but then you maybe aren't really asked to set up a beneficiary. So it's just important to always think about that when you have these accounts, is who's my beneficiary going to be? So with this account, there are 2 appointments you can make if you have a spouse. So if you have a spouse, you can name them as your successor holder or as a beneficiary. A successor holder is in most cases going to be the preferred appointment, because then your surviving spouse inherits your FHSA money as an FHSA. It remains within that account type, whereas a typical beneficiary, they get the money, but it's outside of an FHSA structure. Now, you can only name a spouse as a successor holder, but you could name anyone else as the beneficiary. And the other point on this is the taxation of a beneficiary who's not your spouse. It's quite different from how an RRSP works. So again, it's just one of those things that I think people might get tripped up on just in how they're thinking about it. And this might be going a little bit too into the weeds here, but I think it's important for people to understand this. So with a RRSP, If you name someone who's not your spouse as the beneficiary, they get the entire market value of the account and they do not have to pay the tax. The tax is left with the final tax return of the person who has passed away. With the FHSA account, if you name a non-spouse as a beneficiary, they inherit that money and they will be taxed on the account when it's withdrawn. So it is distinctly different in how it works from a beneficiary for an RRSP. And I just think it's an important thing because it's the opposite tax treatment. It's important to know. And that's it. That's all I got to say on the FHSA.
Wow, I'm sure there's a few other nuggets that are out there, but we'll start to figure out these things a little bit more as they become available to use and whatnot. But Aaron, I myself and the listeners, we owe you a debt of gratitude for all the research that you've done on learning these things up and down. So thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insight.
Thanks a lot, Evan. Appreciate it, and happy to come back on some other day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. Any rates of return or investments discussed are historical or hypothetical and are intended to be used for educational purposes only. You should always consult with your financial, legal, and tax advisors before making changes to your financial plan. Evan Neufeld is a certified financial planner and registered investment fund advisor. Mutual funds and ETFs are provided by Sterling Mutuals, Inc.